when the women began to walk. There were 5 of them, ranging in age from late teens to early 40s, all from the same ruined neighborhood on the edge of what had once been a small manufacturing town in Thuringia. Their shoes were wrong for distance. One of them carried a white cloth tied to a broken broomstick. The others carried nothing. They had discussed this the night before. Leave valuables, wear no lipstick, take off the belt, don't provoke interest. If you're too beautiful, they might look at you. If you're too poor, they might pity you. Both could be dangerous. The girl in front kept repeating the words in English. "Please don't rape us." She said it softly under her breath, but the others heard it anyway. They didn't correct her. It wasn't the grammar they cared about. It was the fear packed inside those 4 words, and the fact that they all knew them by heart. None of them had studied English in school, but they had learned this phrase in the same way they had learned to boil weeds for soup or sleep in a stairwell during shelling, because someone said it might keep them alive. By April 1945, the war had become a rumor that moved faster than any official news. Everyone in town had heard what the Russians were doing in the east. No one knew how much was true, and no one wanted to find out firsthand. The Wehrmacht had retreated days ago. SS men had passed through but didn't stay. The local mayor was gone, and so was the postmaster. What remained was silence, and in that silence, the old women whispered things the young women couldn't forget. "They'll come drunk," one said. "They'll come in trucks. They'll take everything." Another told of villages in Silesia where whole schools of girls were taken and only some returned. One woman claimed to have read a Red Cross report buried in a newspaper last winter. No one believed her, but no one doubted the danger either. But the Americans weren't Russians. That was the other rumor, a quieter one. Some said the Americans gave out chocolate. Others said they gave out bullets. There was talk of soldiers who shared chewing gum with children and soldiers who shot civilians in barns. Stories of order, stories of chaos. It didn't matter. They were all rumors. The truth was walking toward them now, and none of the women could predict what kind of man would be behind the first foreign face they saw. They reached the crossroads where 2 buildings still stood upright, one a half-collapsed bakery, the other a farmhouse with doors hanging loose. A sign scrawled in chalk on a board leaned against a post. AMERICANER. Nothing more. No direction. No warning. They stopped. From the west came the sound of engines, jeeps, not tanks. They stood still, hands visible, and waited. The girl with the white cloth held it up, but it trembled, not from wind. Her hands were shaking. The first vehicle rolled into view. Olive drab paint, stenciled numbers, canvas top. 2 men inside. One drove with one hand and held a cigarette with the other. The passenger looked directly at the women, nodded once, then leaned out to signal someone behind him. A second jeep followed, then a third. None of the soldiers raised their weapons. There were no shouted orders, no rush of boots. The Americans slowed, stopped, and stayed seated. The lead driver spoke. His German was poor but understandable. "You civilians?" he asked. One of the older women nodded. "Where's the Bürgermeister?" "Gone." "You have weapons?" "No." "You need food?" A nod. He stepped out, not quickly, not slowly. His uniform was clean but creased. He wore no medals, no helmet, just a cap pulled low. He gestured for them to stay where they were, then walked back to the second jeep. He spoke with someone, another man, broader, carrying a clipboard. 2 more soldiers joined them, one with an armband marked MP. They were younger than expected. Boys, really. None of them seemed afraid. None of them seemed eager either. One of the women whispered, "Why aren't they doing anything?" The girl with the white cloth lowered it. The man with the clipboard approached. "We're registering all civilians," he said in slow, clear German. "No one is to move beyond the town without escort. You will wait here. Someone will come to record names." "Will we be safe?" one of the women asked. The man glanced at her. "You're not under arrest." "That's not what I meant." He looked at her again. He didn't answer. Another jeep arrived, this one marked with a red cross. A medical corpsman stepped out. He asked if anyone was hurt. One of the women pointed to her ankle, swollen from a twisted step the day before. He checked it, offered a wrap, then gave her 2 biscuits and a canteen. Still, no one touched them. No doors were kicked in. No threats were made. A few soldiers lit cigarettes. One asked if there were any children in the village. Another took down the names of the 5 women, asked if they had family, and noted the location on a pad. When a young private offered a pack of American gum to the youngest girl, she didn't take it. She stared at him, expecting some trick, some request in exchange. He just nodded and dropped it on the ground, then walked away. Time passed, an hour, maybe more. The town behind them didn't burn. The soldiers didn't enter homes without reason. They posted signs. They posted guards. They moved on. More trucks arrived, but only with supplies. There was no looting, no laughter, no chaos. Only control. Later, the women sat behind the shell of the bakery, chewing slowly through hard biscuits and watching the soldiers disappear behind the bend in the road. They hadn't been touched. Not a hand. Not a word out of place. The fear hadn't gone, but it hadn't been justified either. The girl who had first spoken the English phrase looked at the gum still lying in the dirt. She picked it up, held it a moment, and said, "They didn't even look." One of the older women replied, "They were trained." She didn't say it with gratitude. She said it with confusion. Far off, the low rumble of tanks grew louder. Another column, perhaps, another unit. The women stood again. The Americans had left no promises, only orders. And they had followed them. They didn't know that 3 towns over, a court-martial had been held just last week for a soldier accused of assaulting a civilian. He was sentenced swiftly, dishonorable discharge, 20 years in prison. The orders had been clear: discipline or be replaced. In some units, men were rotated out after misconduct. In others, entire companies were reminded with bullet-pointed memos that rape was not a wartime privilege, it was a capital offense. The 5 women didn't know those details, but they felt the result. Another jeep appeared over the hill. They stayed where they were. They didn't raise the white cloth again. Not yet. The jeep came to a stop just short of the town square. The soldier in the passenger seat stepped down, brushed dust from his sleeve, and scanned the street. No gunfire, no movement, just the smell of wet stone and ash. A line of civilian women stood off to the side, still as statues, watching but not speaking. He looked back at the driver and nodded. It was safe for now. They were part of the 89th Infantry Division, a relatively new unit in the field. Most of its men had arrived in Europe only weeks earlier. The officer in charge, a first lieutenant from Ohio, carried a folded clipboard under his arm. His boots were clean, his voice calm, and he didn't draw his pistol. Instead, he called to a nearby corporal. "Set the MP station up by the clock tower, civilian control point just behind it, and make sure the medics are out front. I don't want any confusion." The American advance was no longer a rush. Germany was falling apart, and this was the mop-up. But that didn't mean rules were relaxed. In fact, they were being enforced harder than before. Eisenhower had made it clear. The Americans were not there to take revenge. They were there to occupy, restore order, and prove the difference between civilization and barbarism. Behind the front lines, every unit received orders in plain language. Looting, assault, or mistreatment of civilians would not be tolerated. The articles of war were quoted in the briefings. Rape was a court-martial offense. In theory, it could carry the death penalty. In practice, it often meant 20 years in prison and a dishonorable discharge. And people were watching. Military police, unit commanders, Red Cross observers, even the Signal Corps with cameras. One of the 5 German women who had met the earlier jeep, the girl with the white cloth, was still nearby. She stood with her arms folded, uncertain whether to step closer or stay hidden. The lieutenant noticed her but made no move toward her. Instead, he gestured for a translator. The translator was a private first class from Chicago, fluent in high school German now over his head. He stepped forward slowly, said, "Wir sind Heirer zu helfen, Sie sind sicher. We are here to help. You are safe." She didn't answer, but she didn't run either. Across the square, another squad of soldiers set up a registration table. They used a church pew as a desk. Blank forms were pinned under field radios. Each civilian was to be documented: name, age, address, occupation, known political affiliation. Women and men were processed separately. Those with injuries were escorted to the medics. No one was allowed to move beyond the boundary posts without a stamped pass. The Germans had no system left. The Americans brought one with them. Even in disorder, there was form. The MP detachment, military police, checked rifles, confirmed serial numbers, and issued armbands. No unauthorized soldier could stay in the civilian zone without a purpose and a signed log. Any man found alone with a local woman risked being reported. Some units were more relaxed, but this one followed orders down to the letter. It wasn't about mercy. It was about command. A sergeant barked orders at two privates lingering too close to the bakery window. "Keep walking. Don't stare." They obeyed. The lieutenant scanned a printed bulletin clipped to his clipboard. Directive 174, Civilian Conduct Standards. Paragraph 3, Fraternization is forbidden. Sexual contact, consensual or otherwise, is prohibited. Violators will be subject to immediate disciplinary action. This directive had come down after previous incidents in France and Belgium, where discipline had slipped and headlines followed. Now there would be no headlines, only silence and control. Farther down the road, a Red Cross truck arrived. An American nurse stepped out, followed by two male staff. They set up a temporary aid station. The German women watched, unsure if they were allowed to approach. The nurse waved one of them over. When she offered a blanket, the woman flinched. It would take more than a gesture to undo months of fear. At a nearby barn repurposed as a temporary holding point, the Americans stored confiscated weapons. Hunting rifles, kitchen knives, broken revolvers, every item tagged. The women were questioned again. Had they seen SS men? Had they seen any German soldiers in civilian clothes? One woman said yes. She described a man with a limp who had vanished 2 nights before. The soldier took her report and handed her a tin of powdered milk. One of the American soldiers, barely 20, muttered to another, "They look at us like we're monsters." The reply came back flat, "They've been told we are." The first soldier didn't argue, he walked away. The women were offered food, canned meat, crackers, a bitter coffee substitute. One refused. Another wept when handed a chocolate bar, not from gratitude, from confusion. The lieutenant made his rounds again. He checked that the men were spaced out and that no one was talking to civilians without a reason. He reminded his sergeants, no loitering, no wandering off, no visits after dark. "Don't give them a reason to write anything down," he said. In the command tent, a wire message hung from the dispatch hook. It reported a separate unit farther north where 2 men had been arrested by MPs after a complaint. The lieutenant read the summary twice. It ended with, "Discipline reinforced. Investigation ongoing. No civilian fatalities." He folded the paper carefully and slid it back into its envelope. Outside, the women had been gathered near the aid station. A Red Cross worker was speaking through an interpreter. She explained that those without homes would be relocated to a safer location once troop movements allowed. Until then, they would be assigned quarters in nearby structures. There would be watches posted. Doors would remain open during daylight. No American soldier would be allowed inside without a second witness present. No one clapped. No one cheered. The women nodded once, then waited for the next instruction. One of the younger girls asked the nurse, "Are you allowed to speak with us?" The nurse replied, "Only in public." That answer seemed to unsettle her more than if it had been no. By dusk, the square was lit only by lamps and fire barrels. The Americans rotated guards. Civilian women were housed in 2 locations, one inside the school, the other inside a hotel that hadn't been used in weeks. Doors were secured. Logs were kept. The Americans stood outside, rifles at rest. They didn't speak unless spoken to. Inside the hotel, the women slept in their coats. The floor was cold. The fear hadn't left, but it hadn't grown either. In a room upstairs, the girl with the white cloth stared at the ceiling and whispered to the woman beside her, "I think they're watching each other more than us." The older woman replied, "That's the only reason we're safe." Downstairs, 2 MPs compared notes. One of them had served in Normandy. He had seen how fast things could break down. He tapped the report log and muttered, "Better boring than court-martial." A vehicle arrived just before midnight. It brought new orders. A colonel from Division Command would be inspecting the site tomorrow. All files had to be in order. Any civilian complaints would be reviewed. Soldiers were warned again. One incident, and they'd be on a transport ship before dawn. The women didn't know about that memo, but the men guarding them did. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked. The night remained quiet. But by morning, something else would arrive that the Americans couldn't control, another rumor, this time from a nearby village where restraint hadn't held. The hotel room was quiet except for the rustle of coats against rough floorboards. The women lay side by side in their clothes, shoes still on. No one snored. No one slept deeply. When the wind moved through the broken frame of the upstairs window, they all looked up at once, unsure if it was weather or boots. Nothing came. The morning brought footsteps on gravel and the metallic clink of rifles being shouldered. The MPs switched shifts. New faces took posts at the main entrance, not looking at the women as they passed. One of the soldiers adjusted the strap of his helmet, glanced inside the open door and moved on. The girl with the white cloth, now folded in her coat pocket, watched him. He didn't return the stare. She wasn't sure if that made her safer or more uncertain. They were called outside an hour after sunrise. No formations, no shouted commands. Just a medic calling out in halting German that breakfast was available. Canned hash, dry crackers, something warm poured from a steel drum into tin mugs. One woman asked if they had to do anything in return. The answer was no. They ate in silence under the overcast sky. A few of the American soldiers stood nearby, watching the road more than the women. A chaplain walked through the square, talking to no one but nodding politely when eyes met. He carried a Bible but didn't speak. By noon, a lieutenant gave instructions through the translator. A British liaison was on his way. Some civilians might be moved out of the region within the next 2 days. Until then, the women were to remain within marked boundaries. They were free to walk between the hotel, the square, and the church, but not beyond. Any violation would result in detainment, not punishment, just relocation under guard. The women nodded. They didn't ask where the British would take them. They didn't ask when the Americans would leave. Those questions belonged to people who thought they had options. These women didn't. They returned to the hotel, sat by the windows and waited. Nothing happened. No searches. No confiscations. No sudden orders to line up. They were given blankets in the afternoon, not taken from them. A medic offered soap and iodine for the woman with the swollen ankle. A corporal handed out small boxes of army rations, enough for one per person, no lectures attached. Still, no one touched them. It became harder to interpret. One of the women whispered that maybe it was a trick. Maybe the Americans wanted trust first. Maybe tonight would be different. Another shook her head. They're not even looking at us. It wasn't indifference. It was detachment, intentional structured distance. A soldier entered the lobby only once. He knocked first, and then asked through the translator if anyone needed more water. He didn't look around the room. He kept his hands behind his back, as if trained not to touch anything. When he left, the women waited for something to follow. Nothing did. That evening, a Red Cross representative arrived in a jeep with a Swiss insignia on his sleeve. He met with the American officers, then came to the hotel with a clipboard and a list of questions. Name, age, marital status, previous occupation. Had they been harmed? Had they been threatened? Had anything been taken? The women answered one by one. The girl with the white cloth hesitated, then asked in a quiet voice if the Red Cross man was sure this wasn't just another record for internment. He assured her it was not. "We need to verify treatment of civilians," he said. "For the record, for Geneva." She didn't know where Geneva was, but she nodded. Later, the Red Cross man returned to the jeep, made notes, and reported to the officer on duty. The Americans had followed protocol. No violations reported. No complaints filed. Still, the tension didn't lift. It settled differently now, less like fear and more like confusion. The women weren't being abused. They also weren't being acknowledged. They weren't suspects, weren't prisoners, weren't collaborators. They were something else entirely. Civilians on paper, ghosts in practice. Managed, registered, fed, and forgotten. 3 soldiers passed through the square carrying a wooden crate. One of the women watched closely, expecting some reaction, even a comment. Nothing. The soldiers said nothing, made no jokes, didn't glance her way. She looked down at her hands. It was as if she didn't exist. A rumor arrived that night. A civilian woman from a neighboring village was brought in with her brother. They had traveled on foot and were caught crossing through restricted land. She spoke fast and loud, trying to explain. Her dialect was thicker than the others. What they understood was simple: another village, same Americans, no incidents, no searches. A soldier had offered her a cigarette and kept walking. But in Wanfried, she said, they say a woman screamed. The MPs came, took 3 men away. No one knew if it was true. The Americans didn't mention it. Another night passed. The soldiers rotated again. The MPs carried flashlights but used them rarely. One soldier was heard coughing from inside a tent. Another practiced Morse code on a hand radio. The war, though not over, had moved past this place. By now the women had memorized the faces of the guards. They noticed who walked with a limp, who laughed too loudly, who checked his watch more often than the others. And they noticed the absence of certain things. No laughter aimed at them. No whistles. No nicknames. No questions about where their husbands were. No searching glances when they adjusted their coats. One of the younger women muttered as she lay down that night, "If they hate us, they don't show it." Another replied, "If they pity us, they don't either." A day later, the British arrived. 2 trucks, a few officers, 1 interpreter. They spoke formally, requested records, and issued transfer orders. The women would be sent to a temporary civilian camp near Kassel for processing. Their property, such as it was, would be inventoried and returned upon release. There were forms to sign, more questions to answer. No one explained what came after that. As the women boarded the truck, one turned back toward the American guards. She opened her mouth to say something but stopped. There was nothing to thank them for, and nothing to accuse them of. She climbed into the truck and sat with her hands folded, facing forward. The Americans didn't wave. The truck pulled away in silence, past the hotel, past the square, past the posted signs. Nothing had happened. And that, in the end, was the part none of them could explain. Not to the next group, not to each other, not even to themselves. The lieutenant stood by the post and watched the trucks go. He flipped open his clipboard and crossed off a line. He didn't see the message coming down from Corps headquarters that morning: a new case under review, another town, another unit, a soldier under arrest, court-martial pending, witnesses to be questioned. There was a pattern forming. And not every town would be like this one. They arrived at the Kassel Civilian Processing Center in a covered truck with wooden benches and canvas flaps. No one spoke during the ride. When the guards opened the rear flap, the women stepped down one at a time, eyes fixed on the dirt. The center had been a school before the war. Now it held civilians from across the region, women, children, old men, a few wounded, and some former prisoners. Everything was marked. Everything was recorded. The Americans at Kassel behaved much like the ones they had left behind. Order, not friendliness. Structure, not sympathy. But the women noticed it now for what it was. Not distance. Not cruelty, just restraint. The same interpreter from the last town was here, working a different post. He recognized the girl with the white cloth, nodded once, and returned to his ledger. She didn't speak to him. There was nothing more to say. Over the next 2 weeks, the women were interviewed again, this time by Allied Civil Affairs personnel. They were asked to identify military buildings, known Nazi officials, SS hiding places. Each woman was questioned separately. The tone was direct but neutral. When asked if they had been mistreated by American forces, each answered no. The officer recording the answers barely looked up. He had heard more complicated stories from other places. They shared quarters with civilians from towns where the Americans hadn't been the first to arrive. One group had come from an area briefly passed through by Red Army scouts. Their story was not the same. 2 women had been attacked. One was still missing. The Americans took the reports seriously, but the difference in reactions between the groups was noticeable. The Kassel women were quiet. The others were raw, openly angry, openly afraid. At night, the conversations turned to comparisons. Who had seen what, who had been spared, who had lost more. One woman from Breslau, older and sharp-tongued, accused the Kassel women of lying. "You think silence will protect you?" she asked. "The silence is the most dangerous thing." The girl with the white cloth answered, "We don't have anything to hide." That's not the same as having nothing to fear. The argument didn't last. There was nothing to win. They were all displaced, all powerless, all waiting for a future that didn't yet have a shape. The Red Cross returned during the 3rd week. this time with more supplies and additional field agents. One officer carried a file of typed summaries, testimonies collected from women across occupied Germany. Some pages documented violence, others described theft. A few, like the ones from Kassel, simply stated, "No incident reported, civilian behavior cooperative, U.S. conduct appropriate." But the summaries didn't erase the fear still living in the corners of the camp. It lingered in the way the women paused before entering a room with male guards, in the way they avoided eye contact, in the way they kept their shoes close at night. Restraint did not erase trauma. It only prevented its repetition. Still, something was shifting, not in the camp but in the conversation. A Dutch journalist, granted limited access to several civilian camps, later wrote in his notebook, "There is a quiet astonishment among German women when discipline holds. They come expecting the worst and leave having experienced nothing. And somehow, that absence becomes more difficult to process than pain would have been." The Americans didn't hear those reflections. Most of the men rotating through guard duty never asked. They followed orders, passed out rations, checked documents, then moved to the next post. The system didn't depend on compassion. It depended on oversight. And the oversight worked most of the time. In Kassel, word spread about a court-martial taking place in Frankfurt. A soldier had been charged with assaulting a civilian girl near a supply depot. The news came through an American translator who read from a bulletin in the canteen. Sentence, 20 years. Stripped of rank, dishonorable discharge, no appeal. No names were given, but the consequences were clear. One of the German women overheard the bulletin being read. She turned to the others and said, "They punish their own." Another replied, "Sometimes." It wasn't trust, but it was something. Weeks passed. One by one, the women were cleared to leave. Some had families who could take them. Others were sent to rural zones where housing remained intact. The girl with the white cloth, now gray from handling, folded it into her satchel and walked out with a transport convoy heading west. No one had asked her what she learned. She wouldn't have known how to answer. She hadn't been assaulted. She hadn't been touched. She hadn't been thanked or blamed or even much spoken to. She had simply passed through the war and been left alone. It didn't feel like mercy. It felt like something colder, quieter. But maybe that was what peace actually looked like. Discipline wasn't a headline. It wasn't dramatic. It left no mark you could photograph, no scar you could show. But it changed what happened next. Because the absence of violence altered memory. It shaped the words people chose when describing their survival. Years later, in post-war interviews conducted by German sociologists documenting women's experiences during the occupation, many listed not being harmed as the most surprising event of the spring of 1945. One wrote, "I had prepared myself for the worst. I had practiced the phrase in English. I had no idea that nothing would happen." Another wrote, "They spoke little, they touched nothing, and somehow that was more shocking than anything else." Those responses formed a contrast in a landscape of brutal stories. Not to deny what others suffered, but to highlight how one system, when enforced, could contain the chaos, not eliminate it, but contain it. Historians reviewing the conduct of Allied troops in post-war Germany often point out the variance. In some places, restraint collapsed. In others, it held. Where it held, the reason was not cultural. It was procedural, orders, oversight, consequences. What changed outcomes wasn't the flag, it was what followed the flag. Courts, logs, commands. The Americans didn't always live up to their rules. But in places like Kassel, the rules lived longer than the war. The girl with the cloth never made a formal statement. She didn't write a memoir. Her name never appeared in a newsreel or a textbook. But in a war where rumor carried the weight of truth, and fear shaped every decision, her story was something different.